Here we
Great.
go. Okay, so I mean, I say that it's not really true, but like you'll see what I mean by that. So anyway, this is Locke 2. We're gonna finish Locke today, and then it'll be exciting. Like probably 2 weeks to talk about just some modern controversies that are related to everything that we've talked about up until this point, and then we get to talk about Marx and do some other fun stuff and do cultural Marxism and stuff like that.
Oh, dude, I forgot to tell you, Brian. I can't be there for all of those weeks.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. Looking forward to that. So anyway, so we're going to build up to Locke's right to revolution today, but first we have to talk about his idea of limited government. And before we do that, we should just recap where we've been with Locke. So remember, yes, last week we talked about where Locke begins, and Locke begins with a state of nature similar to Hobbes, except not similar to Hobbes, because for Locke, the state of nature is a state of perfect freedom. It's constrained by natural law. What is natural law? Natural law is God's law. It's discerned through reason, and we know what the natural law is. We know it because we just do. When we're like using our heads, this is what Locke thinks. When we're using our heads, when we think, we can sort of recognize in each other that everybody has things called rights, and this is where we get rights from. It's just like if you just consult your reason, that's the language he uses. Consult your reason, and you'll know it's true that we all have the right to life, liberty, and property. And so the law of nature in the state of nature is that no one should harm each other in their health, their liberty, and possessions. You shall not kill, you shall not steal, etc. You shall not harm. These are not sort of like, they come from God, but they're not discerned through God. They're discerned through human reason. And that's where we get the sort of Lockean rights from. And the rights tradition among modern liberalism comes from this idea, and it's based on that sort of rather, I think, flimsy notion that if you just consult your reason, you'll know it's true that we all have rights. But the problem though is in the state of nature, these rights that we have are somewhat lacking, and we kind of discovered that last week. But so again, I wanted to sort of make this bring this quote out because it's interesting. So Locke is describing his state of nature, and he says this. He says, "And here we have the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war, which, however some men have confounded, are so far distant as a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, and a state of enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction are one from another." So here Locke is telling us why the state of nature is a great thing. It's not a state of war. It's a complete opposite from the state of war, actually. And so who does he have in mind here when he's saying some men have confounded this? Some men have confounded the state of nature for the state of war. Who is he talking about?
The dude that painted the picture of the king with all the people in it.
Yeah, that's Hobbes, right? So he's saying some men, read Hobbes, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, have confounded the state of nature with the state of war. They think human beings are naturally predisposed to desire what other men have and take what they will, and harm each other. I think Hobbes's actual language is like, we have a natural proclivity to harm each other. Hobbes's state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, remember? But so Locke here is saying, no, you've mistaken the state of nature for the state of war. The state of nature is a wondrous place. It's freedom. It's you get to sort of dispense with your property as you will, acquire as much property as you will. It's a wonderful thing. And look, we have these natural rights, and we all recognize each other for having these things. It's great. We should stay in the state of nature, or at least we will stay in it as long as we can. The problem, though, is, he ends up writing the rest of the book all about not the state of nature, what happens after the state of nature. And so the question is, why exit the state of nature? We built this all up last week. We exit the state of nature because of the problem of enforcement. Political society, what we make when we leave the state of nature, provides three things that don't exist in the state of nature, which is, one, a known, established, settled law, just an agreement among everybody about what's right and wrong and how we should proceed. Two, known and indifferent judges, right? So when disputes occur, we want a third party. right, to sort of settle disputes. Those don't exist in the state of nature. You can't sort of agree, like, sure, we can get a third party. I'll get my friend to come help me out in a dispute, but like, you're not going to recognize that as a valid third party. It's my friend. But in political society, we have known and established indifferent judges, right? And so that's like a really important thing for a stable society is having indifferent judges. And 3 is the power to execute sentences. Enforcement, in other words, right? The power to overwhelm criminals with concentrated force. So that's the general logic. The flight from the state of nature is a sort of reluctant one. We wish we could stay in the state of nature because that's where we exist in our most natural state, and our natural state is to own property. Locke is the theorist of property acquisition. We are the property owning animal for Locke, right? Aristotle says we're the political animal. Hobbes says we're the, hostile animal, something like that. For Locke, we're the property owning animal. We form political societies, we form governments, we do politics chiefly to protect our property. We can't protect our property in the state of nature because somebody will steal it. I will kill that person. Their brother will come kill me. My wife will, kill that. It devolves into the state of war eventually. But so we want to sort of secure our property. And so we form political societies, we form governments, we do politics. We don't do these things by nature, like Aristotle might say. Locke agrees with Hobbes that we do these things by art, but we do them to own property, not to sort of, get us out of the state of nature. We would rather stay in the state of nature, but we have to leave, and so we do it to form property, to protect our property rights. So this is a kind of unique, at least to this point in history, claim that the purpose of politics is to protect our property rights. If we remember back to the ancients, how would they view this vision of politics? The only reason we're doing politics is to protect our property rights. What would Aristotle say about that? He would think that's pretty lacking, right? He'd be like, well, that's a pretty limited vision of what politics is for, and He
would say like more like community, like the creation of like our culture and society.
Yeah, totally. He would view this as like, he would be disappointed. He would just be disappointed in us and in viewing the sort, like he wants us to recognize the synergy that happens when people come together and do politics. It's something more than the sum of our parts is like kind of what the ancients are after. Whereas Locke is sort of constructing the political society solely to sort of protect like an individual right, that can't be protected when we're solely individuals. And so, Aristotle might think that's a kind of that's a not very expansive vision of what politics is for or what it's about. And he wouldn't, but so anyway, so that's Locke's vision. And the Aristotelian critique of that, the ancient critique, is different, right? It's different. It's a different critique, isn't it, than like the modern leftist critique, perhaps, of like a political vision that is solely about property rights. Like you can imagine somebody saying that in like a Republican primary, but you wouldn't get the counter to that from the Democrats. They wouldn't say something like, "Oh no, our political vision is being, limited." They would say something like, this is, they wouldn't levy the Aristotelian critique to Locke. They would say something else. They would, they might have something. This leaves out some people, right? But so in many ways, what Locke is writing here in the second treatise is a sort of anti-communist manifesto. And it sounds pretty libertarian. It's rather right-wing, and you'd be right to characterize it as such. The whole school of modern economics is often attributed to Adam Smith, who comes a century later, but Locke really sort of prefigures him by a whole century by making property acquisition central to the whole political economy. And, but Locke's influence over, modern libertarians, Murray Rothbard, Nozick, the Chicago School, it's rivaled only really by Locke's influence among the sort of universalist and humanitarian left, like the humanist left. Figures such as Frederick Davis, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, they all owe Locke a great deal. How could that be so? And so I will tell you. So let's construct the revolutionary Locke to find out. So that's where we're going to go. The end of the lecture today, we'll find out what Angela Davis and Malcolm X, why they like Locke. So first, we're going to talk about how to create a government. This is how Locke thinks we create a government. We leave the state of nature, of course, and we create a government. And we do this by first forming a political society. And then we establish the mechanics of government. So something called political society exists separate from government. That's the idea here. Underneath the government, underneath all the structures and the institutions that we might think of as the government, there's actually something called political society. And so that's like a sort of innovation here that will help us get us where we need to go. How do you form a political society? Right, which is different than the government, right? We form a government on top of political society, but how do you form a political society? First, we get together with others who are similarly frustrated with the state of nature. And what do we mean by frustrated? We mean, well, I can't secure my property. I created a fence around my land. I have an apple growing orchard or whatever, and people keep coming and stealing my apples. I try and sort of dispense justice on my own turn. I do it myself. I've hired a private company to sort of serve as a security guard or go sort of deliver justice, but it's not really working out because they're coming and killing my security guards. It's just devolving into a system where I need something other than just my own sense or my own self for and whoever I could hire to deliver justice, right? And so I would get together with other people who are experiencing the same thing, and we all would be experiencing the same things, Locke would say. And so we sort of agree. What we do is we get together and we agree to surrender some of our executive power, our surrender some of our liberty, some of that wondrous liberty that we were enjoying in the state of nature, that we love the state of nature so much for providing us with. We surrender it. We surrender it to the community as a whole, right? We say, like, look, we're all going to sort of look out for each other. I got your back, you got mine. And we will agree to abide by the majority rule, right? And so this is the beginnings of political society. This is how we sort of create, maybe another word for it would be a sort of culture, like a political culture. Just a sense, like an enduring group of people that all have sort of like agreed to work together. That's not a government, is it? Right? It's different than a government. It's a sense, it's a group sense of community that doesn't have a government built on top of it yet, but they've all agreed that like something like a government they will create, right, in order to protect each other. And so this majority will idea comes to be really influential. And this is where kind of we first get it in the modern world, right? Minority bound by the will of the majority. Otherwise, community couldn't function as a community. But individuals in the minority today may be in the majority tomorrow, right? So it is often in their interest to abide by the will of the majority. So there's a sort of sense of like, there's a sense of fairness, but it's also in your interest, even if you don't agree with the majority, to abide by the majority.
Yeah, that sounds super fucking bleak. Like it's like, I don't know, like the right word. It just sounds really fucking bleak.
Does that sound like a tyranny of the majority? Is that what you're
No,
after?
it just sounds like it's more like, and again, I guess this is like a very surface level analysis, but to me it sounds like he's like, yeah, you know what? Like you're in the minority, like kind of fuck off, because one day you might be in or you're in the majority. I don't really know. He's basically saying like this is all you can hope for, so you got to kind of live up to it and don't want too much because you're gonna get fucked over if you go against the grain.
Yeah, that is not that altogether dissimilar from what he's saying. He would think that it's sufficient that, like, you have joined this political society. You're never going to be that much different than anybody else. The groupings that you'll be a part of that make you a minority won't be so damaging to your ability to sort of be in this community. They're not gonna distance you that far from everybody else. And maybe that's kind of what you're after. It's like, how could I form community with people that like just disagree with me on a fundamental level? And Locke would say to you, like, yeah, you're not going to form a community. You will form a community with somebody else, and you'll disagree
it's
with
not even
them.
that. It's more.
Okay.
I guess it's more like I feel like that's part of what creates a society and a community is that you have like a diversity of opinions and you have like a range of voices that are able to kind of amalgamate and unify and disagree and find like middle ground versus like this really like nihilistic, like, hey, like you better not complain too much and you better go along with it because you're going to be in the barrel one day too, and you don't want everyone to like, bring the pitchforks out. Like that's my interpretation of it, at least, and maybe I'm misreading it.
No, yeah. So you're saying that, like, isn't there more than just the sort of like understanding that tomorrow I might get my way?
Yeah, that's like it's very fatalistic. Yeah,
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's not really developed in Locke. So much so that, like, a lot of folks that are influenced by Locke, and we'll see in the American founding, they're very worried about the tyranny of the majority. So much so that they almost make it a tyranny of the minority, a tyranny of the property owning white minority. That's kind of the ethos of
and I guess I don't really have a comment on that side of it yet. I don't feel like I understand it well enough what you just said, but I certainly like vibe a lot of the other things, sanctity of individual property rights and that whole song and dance. Like I'm a very big fan of, but I'm just like, damn, bro, like that's a fucking really bleak outlook on the world that like we're essentially only able to work together because otherwise we're going to get, I don't know, just I don't think it's incompatible to believe in like private property rights while also believe in like some level of altruism and a larger like common good that's not based out of fear, I guess.
Yeah, so again, there is no threat of despotism. There's no threat of authoritarianism here. Locke is, that's Hobbes. Like the sort of like, you must agree to the will of the majority is, there isn't a lot of force behind Locke's claim. Locke's sort of like, Locke thinks that you're going to want to do it. In other words, even he thinks you're going to want to do it because
maybe I just read too much into that sentence and the connotation.
Okay. Yeah, I think so too. Again, so this idea of the political community, the political society that exists underneath government, it's important to Locke. And again, I think that's kind of what he's saying. Like, you're going to want to be a part of this, guys. Even to the extent that you'll want to go along with the majority rules if you're the minority. It's going to be good. It's going to be better than what the state of than what you just left. In fact, we're going to make sure it's better than what you just left, and we'll talk about that later. So again, we formed government by first creating political society, then we established the mechanics of government. The people then decide on the form of government. How will powers be divided? Will we have a king or a president? Will we have unicameral or bicameral legislature? How frequently will the legislature meet? And so let's take a look at what he says about that. Page 68. Right. So he says, the majority having, as has been showed, upon men's first uniting in society, the whole power of the community naturally in them may employ all that power in making laws for the community from time to time and executing those laws by officers of their own appointing. And then the form of government is a perfect democracy, or else may put the power of making laws into the hands of a few select men and their heirs of successors, and then it is an oligarchy, or else in the hands of one man, and then it is the monarchy. If to him and his heirs it is a hereditary monarchy, if to him only for life, but upon his death the power only of nominating a successor to return to them, an elective monarchy. And so accordingly of these, the community may make compounded and mixed forms of government as they think good. And if the legislative power be at first given by the majority to one or more persons only for their lives or any limited time, then the supreme power to revert to them again when it is so reverted. The community may dispose of it again anew into what hands they please, and so constitute a new form of government. So essentially here the idea, so he goes through that whole list of things, but he says that the political community exists permanently underneath whatever the form of government is sort of occurring in that period of time. There will exist a political community underneath it that can sustain it, but also dismantle it, right? And erect something new. They'll still be called France, but they're not going to be a monarchy anymore, right? They'll still be called America, but they won't be a constitutional democracy or whatever the hell, right? That's the kind of idea, is that like we as a people will still sort of like persist as a political unit, but our government might change. And so that's a sort of like an interesting claim here that Locke is making here. Here we are. So right. So we should talk a little bit about the division of powers. And so Locke, he goes through and says like, this is a monarchy, this is an oligarchy. He really has he likes the idea of a limited, divided government. The one that we all recognize, right? The one with the legislative and the executive powers being divided from each other. And so this is his vision, the one that we copied. The executive power must be distinct from the legislative power, for the legislators will be tempted to exempt themselves from law, right? And so we have to make the sort of executive force be distinct from the ones actually making the law, so that they can have oversight over each other. The legislative power is the power to make laws. Executive power is the power to execute the laws. In addition to the legislative and executive power, there's also federative power, power of war and peace, power to form leagues and make alliances. The executive and federative powers should be in the hands of one person, since both require force. And force should be in a set of single hands. Having the force of the public in two separate hands, or two different hands, sets of hands, and under two different commands, it would bring ruin. This is what he says. There's a whole paragraph talking about how if executive and federative powers are distinct, that it's not great. At the same time, executive and federative powers are subordinate to legislative power. Just as people have right to regulate legislative power has the right to regulate executive and federative. And at the top, right, the most powerful is the power of the people. And that's precisely what he said before. Underneath the government exists political society, because they're the ones with ultimate power, right? And so they could tear down the structure if they see fit. That structure exists based on their consent. And so consent is actually a Lockean term that many books have been written about, tacit versus explicit consent. Yeah. So great. And then so next we're going to talk about the nature and the extent of powers. We're moving right along here. This is great. Any questions so far? Okay. So both executive and legislative powers are limited, and they must be limited. And they have to be limited in very particular ways. Like I said, the power of the people is the chief power, and so the power of the people have power over the legislative power. And so the rights of the individuals are the first thing that sort of limits legislative power. We get out of the state of nature to protect our rights because they're not being protected in the state of nature. And so the only reason we would ever even leave the state of nature and form government is to make sure those rights are protected even more, right? And so legislative power first has to be constrained by the rights of the people that the legislator for, right? The second limit on legislative power is standing general and publicized laws. Laws will exist as a sort of second pass, check on legislative power. Laws cannot be written to limit the rights of individuals, however, right? Rights of individuals are far more important. And then third, underneath that is trained authorized judges. And so again, we have this idea. If you guys remember, we were talking about Aristotle, we were talking about the rule by men or rule by laws. This is going to come up again. And Locke's idea of standing general and publicized laws is here. They are, in his quote is, they are to govern by promulgated established laws, not to be varied in particular cases, but to have one rule for rich and poor, for the favorite at court and the countryman at plow. And so again, if you kind of remember back to when Locke is writing, he's writing at the end of the heyday of monarchy, right? But the monarchy is waning. I mean, it's like taken 400 more years for it actually to look, who knows how much longer the monarchy in England's going to last. But like, you could kind of sense that around the world, monarchy was falling out of favor. And certainly in England, there was more and more people writing kind of like Locke. But this idea that there's going to be one rule for the favorite at court and the countryman at plow, that's an extremely radical idea, right? One rule for the favorite at court and also for the countryman. That's an interesting idea.
Are you Brian? So are you just trying to understand that? Do you mean that like literally that at that time, or because I don't know if you're like making a political commentary with that statement, or do you literally mean at that time that poor and rich like experience different legislative?
It's not really
parameters.
So in our minds we have this class division between them. But our idea of class is almost it doesn't quite get at the actual division between the aristocracy and the peasants, right? In feudalism, which is the way that we would talk about the class system of this period of time, of course there would be two different sets of laws for these two different people. Everybody would agree that that's natural, actually. It's like, if you, I mean, I don't know, is Game of Thrones like a good example?
Got it.
Just like
no, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Like the folks at court, in like King Robert's court, and the folks that are in the Three Rivers Tavern or whatever the fuck, like somebody could just get their ass killed who's just a goddamn peasant, and like nobody's gonna fucking freak out about it, but if like, Sansa Stark gets fucking murdered, like there's gonna be a goddamn war, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of the idea. It's like the laws are, of course there's two separate, divisions of and that's what we mean by class. Our vision of class is much different. We have like the poor and the middle class and the rich. They have like different like that one's a human being, the other person's a piece of shit peasant, that's kind of closer to what they have in mind. But so anyway, so Locke is dismantling with all that. Locke is saying like, no, we're all human beings, we're all equal, we all have rights, the same rights, actually. Wild. So again, like I said, so trained authorized judges. So Locke is sort of recognizing that these laws are not going to tell us what to do in all cases, right? It's the same problem that Aristotle came up with or thought about. It's like, well, should we have men in charge or should we have laws in charge? And Locke is sort of worried about this as well, and he has a sort of novel way to deal with it. So let's take a look at this, actually. 84. Okay, so he says, so how do we know when the law should rule, or when, there should be somebody who's in charge saying what to do that, there isn't a law about it? So Locke says, many things there are which the law can by no means provide for, and those must necessarily be left to the discretion of him that has the executive power in his hands, to be ordered by him as the public good and advantage shall require. Nay, it is fit that the laws themselves should come in cases give way to the executive power, or rather to this fundamental law of nature. That as much may be, all the members of society are to be preserved, for since many accidents may happen wherein a strict and rigid observation of the laws may do harm, as not to pull down an innocent man's house to stop a fire when the next to it is burning. So that's just, the language is sort of not great. The writing isn't excellent, but the idea here is really wonderful, which is there should be discretion. There should be prerogative held within the executive to break the law when it's good, right? When it's right, when more rights will be protected, when more property will be protected. If somebody needs to break the law in order to sort of secure a grander adherence to the natural law, then that person should be allowed to break the law. It doesn't mean the law is wrong, but it means, but we are going to found in the executive the ability to break the law for the common benefit, right? And so his example is, look, the only reason we're forming political society is to protect property. So why would we ever allow an innocent man's house to be burned, to be pulled down? Well, we would allow for it if his neighbors is on fire, and we need to tear down this perfectly good house in order to prevent the rest of the neighborhood from burning, right? That's like Locke's is like great innovation here. Is like sometimes you're going to actually have to sort of like injure somebody, right? You're going to have to injure somebody's property. And you should have the prerogative to do so. The executive should, if you can guarantee it for everybody else, right?
That seems very incongruent with like contemporary libertarian thought.
I think so. Well, so what would a libertarian, what would like your estimation of like, so like take this example, right? Perhaps it's silly, but there's a fire, some house is on fire in a cul-de-sac, right? And it's the first house in the cul-de-sac that's on fire. There's no hope of saving that house, but if we allow the next house to catch on fire, then there's no chance we would be able to save the rest of them, the rest of the 10. Locke says you tear down that second house so that there's less things to catch fire.
I would look, I'm not a libertarian expert, but I would suppose that the Randian Galt's Gulch like libertarian altruist would argue that if the man who owns that house is just, he would tear the house down himself to prevent like the communal damage. And then I suppose that and again, this is fucking me just making this shit up, but this is just my guesstimation. I could be totally wrong. And I would guess that on like a quote unquote legislative level, they would say that the quote unquote government, i.e. like the social framework, needs to, one, be as limited as possible, and two, be driven completely by private enterprise. So they would say whatever compact the private enterprises had determined to agree to would be the procedure in that situation, but there most certainly would not be a omnipotent body that could make that decision for everyone else.
Yeah, no doubt. And so in that way, Locke's political vision is one that has this, this sort of like powerful thing called government. It's limited in various, really important ways, which we still need to talk about, I think. But yeah, so much that the libertarians that have been influenced by him would have something altogether different to say about this. What do you guys think about this though? This idea of the house burning down, or prerogative? Laws exist and they're not wrong, but like there should be an executive that's allowed to break them when
I think it makes sense. I think that's the social contract, right? You have to have ideally a very limited one, but there has to have there has to be like a governmental structure to make those decisions in the event that those like private enterprise compacts fail or don't exist.
How, I guess I agree with it. I just don't understand how that would happen in a realistic way. Like, are we talking riots? Like, how would that even happen? Like, how would the person who is making the laws wouldn't want it to change, right?
Yeah, I think the idea would be like we create laws on the assumption that like they're gonna work all the time. You know, like they're gonna be persistent and they will always be just. But we're also gonna empower an individual, the executive, with prerogative to break them when a situation arises in which our laws that we have created create a paradox, right? Or they create a situation in which adhering to the law does more harm, right, than breaking the law.
And sorry, maybe I missed this, but this is a single individual is going to be
The
the
executive,
one determining this?
the president.
The president, right? Got it.
And like, yeah, that power can sort of be diffused down through executives, right, to the governor, to the mayor, whatever.
I almost feel like it should be the opposite, I guess.
That
like we should have an executive just
okay, yeah.
executive just leading us, you know, and then there is a room full of people who say like, you know, that's a fucking terrible idea. We veto.
Oh, okay.
Not the
Interesting.
other way around.
Yes. So you empower the executive with sort of unilateral discretion. And then you have the people represented by, the legislature that just sort of do like, reviews of the executive, the executive's like behavior, right? Like their job is to just sort of like follow along 10 days later and be like, was that legit?
Yeah, like
like,
give him
yeah.
red flags and then he gets a certain amount and then, he's out. The guy has to come. So he's over here trying to appease the people while making decisions. It makes his job really hard. Same thing that's happening.
Yeah,
now.
that seems like you'd really neuter someone's ability to actually lead by doing that, right?
No, I think our leader would be someone who, all of those other executives would be elected, obviously, or not executives. All of those other members would be elected into the council, and so they would, in theory, be the people's.
Well,
voice,
but don't you
right?
do you?
And so then the leader would have to be, would have to make decisions that the people wanted.
But don't you think that there are times, and this is perhaps going to come across as like being supportive of like a dictatorship, which I'm most certainly not, but do you not think that there are times that an effective leader has to make unpopular decisions looking at the longer view, and that if they were forced to kowtow to like a popularity contest amongst like, let's call it a legislature or whatever, which to some degree happens now, you aren't left with a situation where where they're very much making executive decisions based on that rather than what's going to be good for the whole. And certainly I agree with you that there should be limitations on that power, right? I mean, again, not to like betray my hand, but I think we have pretty close to like the most perfect system of government that's existed with our current checks and balances. But like, how do you account for that, right? Yeah, and I know your thought. I know your opinions on that, Maverick. But all joking aside, how do you account for that? How do you account for their need to make tough decisions that are going to be unpopular?
Well, let's make a third body called the House of Representatives and have a three-way check system.
Well, so Howard, you said something interesting. You said like, well, that's going to like limit the executive's ability to lead. And it's sort of revealing to me of like, because like Locke really doesn't want the executive to lead. Remember, like Locke is sort of like wants the executive to be beholden to the legislature, which is beholden to the people. And so like all the executive's really supposed to do is execute the laws. But we're also, but since he recognizes also, but like, there's some sort of like clumsiness that executing laws, that a group of people executing laws would have. They would be sort of clumsy at doing it. We want one person to be the executive. And the reason we want one person is because we're going to also give them prerogative and the ability to act quickly to preserve, what we've constructed, the political community, to preserve our rights, right? And so again, the example of the house on fire in the neighborhood is I think the best example of this, which is like the legislature's not going to be able to tear down that person's house, because they're going to have to meet and like call to the meeting and take the minutes and then do old business and then new business, like it's just not going to, like, you need an executive to answer the phone or to, call somebody and say, tear down that guy's house. And you also need the executive, because we're just not going to write a law saying, in the case of a fire in this neighborhood in which one house is on fire and no other houses are on fire, but the next house that gets on fire will, destroy everything else, we should be able to tear down that guy's house. Like, we're not going to write a law that does that, right? That would be silly, right? But we do want an executive to do that. So that's really the limits of the executive. Like in Locke's vision, the only thing the executive should be able to do is exist outside the law where the law is silent, and not doing anything would sort of threaten the stability of the political community or threaten people, the grander vision for rights, right? For property acquisition. And so it's limited, right? This is the limited government idea. This is like,
yeah, no, I actually, the way you just described it, that sounds pretty good. No, it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I like it too, except there's only one problem with that, which is that, there's going to be these gray areas where the law is silent.
Yeah.
And then we're going to, elect one guy who's of a certain affiliation, whatever. And then for his period of time, where is the law silent? Like, I guess what I'm afraid of is, let's say that he's elected every 4 years, this executive, right? Who is making decisions where the law is silent. They just have all power during that time in those decision making in those moments. I don't think leaving anyone at any time to make or enact or make decisions alone is I think the answer to your question, Howard, earlier is no. I really don't believe that people should be making decisions ever that affect a group of people without some sort of
that's fair.
Without some sort of negotiation or something from the people.
Yeah, I agree. I actually
even
agree.
if that is only where the law is silent.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, I just want to say that like this is all limited by people. Locke thinks that we will come together and decide like, hey, dude, that our last president was using his prerogative unjustly or improperly, right? And so that means they're not fit for rule, and so they're not fit for this power, and we should remove it from them, right? The other thing that's baked into this idea of prerogative is the power of pardon, which always comes, whenever a president is like leaving office, like the last things they ever do is like pardon like a huge list of people, and it's normally like non-violent drug offenders, folks that like have some sort of human interest story. They got cancer while they were in prison.
Yeah, like
50th
people
year.
that have been like huge humanitarians that really helped the world, like Rudy Giuliani.
Well, so this is what I'm going to say. It's like famously, as President Trump leaves office, he pardons like all of his like co-conspirators and
I can't believe that as advanced. Like that is the funniest part of our. It's just so blatantly wrong and fucked up that like
Yeah.
that happens every 4 years to like whoever's in
No,
charge.
I agree. What
Like,
that's
what
like.
the fuck?
Yeah, it's
Who?
wild.
None of these political science people, no one would ever say that that's okay anywhere ever.
no, right. And so
So
what
weird.
Locke really has in mind here is the person who pulled down the house that was not on fire yet. The person who actually does it is breaking the law, but we should be able to pardon him because it was quite obvious it was the right thing to do. That's what Locke has in mind, is the person who's breaking the law for the common good, right? Prerogative
Yeah,
is
no,
the power of doing public good without a rule. That's what the quote is. Prerogative is nothing but the power of doing public good without a rule. So pardoning somebody who broke a law that, like, in this instance isn't the right law to adhere to should be pardoned. That's the Lockean justification for pardon.
yeah, no, Locke sounds like a G. It just sounds like I don't know how we've like bastardized and mutated that concept makes sense applied in that way, right? But like Maverick said, we've used that for like both nut jobs on the left and the right to like pardon crooks, and he's right. Literally, it happens every 4 years. Every 4 years, you have a group of Democratic crooks that get pardoned, and every 4 years, you have a group of fucking Republican crooks that get pardoned. And I don't know how we've like bastardized, because yeah, that concept makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we have a lot to we owe a lot to Locke, and we'll see more. So and then he goes through this like really interesting distinction between usurpation and tyranny. Usurpation is the arrogation of lawful power belonging to another body to oneself, right? So taking another body's power and usurping it, right? Taking it upon yourself. So like an executive that sort of oversteps and creates laws has usurped the legislative body. A legislature that sort of executes the laws that they themselves wrote has usurped executive power. Tyranny, however, I'm sorry, I should be down here. Tyranny, however, is power unbounded by law. So where law ends, tyranny begins. And so again, this maybe sound a little bit like prerogative, right? Isn't this what we talked about, where the law is silent, But we have to remember, like, Locke thinks that we can use our reason to discern our rights, right? We're just going to consult our reason and we'll find out what the natural law is, the natural law, right? Of which exists. And so when our sort of human laws would go against natural law, that's where we should use prerogative to sort of, secure that part of our property. But when power is going beyond natural law and it's against, or when going beyond human law and it's against natural law, that's where tyranny begins. So how, I guess the question to you guys, I've sort of developed the entire system now up until now, and you should be able to answer this. How, according to Locke, ought people resist tyranny?
Can you say that one more time? Sorry.
So I've developed the logic of Locke, like we're all Lockean now. How, according to Locke, ought people resist tyranny?
AR-15s.
Checks and balances. Oh, sorry.
Joanna says with reason, which is actually right. So like I was expecting Howard to say what he said, AR-15s. Right, because we're gonna get to revolution, which is the second thing we should do. But the first thing we should do is like kind of make sure. Make sure what we're looking at is actually tyranny. But right, we the power, we have the power to overthrow government, right? Because remember, the political society exists underneath it. And that persists. You know, we are in community with each other, and we can tear down the government that we sort of erected. We erected government to secure our rights, to do something. And if it's not doing that thing, right? If a tyranny is existing instead of something that's protecting our rights, then it's totally within our power to dismantle it. But Joanna says reason, which is, yes, that's precisely right. So the first answer is, where a legal remedy exists for tyranny, then we should exercise that legal remedy, right? Vote them
Isn't
out
by
or something
definition
like that, right?
my conceptualization of tyranny, if it's true tyranny, the legal remedy becomes obsolete because it's being enacted by the ruling whatever, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and so his idea is that we would first try the stuff that like we have on the books, how we deal with these things. Can we vote them out? Can we, whatever. The second, the next, where the legal remedy either does not exist or it's ineffective, we resist government by force. And so this is where we get the right to revolution. This is how we have sort of constructed it. And so the quote here is great quote. The power that every individual gave to society when he entered into it can never revert to individuals again, as long as society lasts, but will always remain in the community, right? Remain in the political community. Because without this, there can be no community, no commonwealth, which is contrary to the original agreement. So also when the society hath placed the legislative in any assembly of men to continue in them and their successors, the legislative can never revert to the people whilst the government lasts. So the power is in the government that we've given our power to government, and we can never get it back while the government lasts. But if they have set limits to the duration of their legislature, or else when by the miscarriages of those in authority, it is forfeited, upon the forfeiture or at the determination of the time set, it reverts to society. It comes back to us. They're the ones that rebelled. We're not rebelled. They're the ones that rebelled. They sort of denied the construct that we've sort of set up for them. And so we get it back. It just sort of falls back into our laps, the ultimate power, the ultimate authority. I do think it's important that he says it can never revert to individuals again. We can never go back to the state of nature. We can never go back to this sort of like homesteady, living in a farm, growing apples and having no society with each other. We've left that, and so now we're in a perpetual community with each other, and we can erect and dismantle governments as we see fit, as the government sort of grows beyond its original charter, or rebels against us, right? I think it's important to say that like we're not the ones starting the revolution. They revolted. Those in power did, by sort of denying the agreements to which we set forth. It reverts to society, he says. It comes back to us. And the people have the right to act as supreme and continue the legislative in themselves or erect a new form. So there's this distinction between the dissolution of political society and the dissolution of government, right? The thing we build on top of political society. There's the government will dissolve. We can get rid of that. That is a transient thing. It's like sand. It's a sandcastle. Political society is the beach. That's not going anywhere, We will persist. Once political society is formed, it's perpetual. This is the same argument that Lincoln makes in the Civil War to sort of like beat down the South. He says, no, you guys can't, we're in political society with each other. Like your disagreement with me, with my government is one thing, but you're trying to make your own political society, and it's just not reasonable. You can come to me with your ideas for changing our government, but you want to come to me with your ideas for making a new political society, and that is not going to fly. That was Lincoln's argument. Governments are dissolved when they egregiously breach the people's trust. So examples: when the executive usurps legislative power, when executive refuses to call parliament, when executive arbitrarily alters the rules of an election, or when the executive fails to execute just laws. Government is dissolved in those senses. The same principle applies to legislative power, right? When the legislature invades the property of its subjects, it acts contrary to their trust, and so the people are no longer obliged to obey it. Upon the dissolution of government, it's up to society to form a new government. Right? Remember, it's not like the government dissolves and we're in political society and then we can just proceed from there. You know, we had to build a government to sort of solve for these problems that we had, you know, in the state of nature, like the cycle of revengeance over breaches of property trust, and the how we needed known and indifferent judges. We needed these things that a government can provide us. And so when we dissolve the government, it is incumbent upon us to make a new one. And then he also has this idea of preemptive dissolution, and we'll see this actually copied in our design. People may set revolution in motion when tyranny is but in design. When we can tell it's happening, but it's not quite here yet, but we know that that's where they want to go. We can actually, revolution is justified in that instance. The people have the power to do that, right? We're the judge in that case. So we're going to transition now. We're almost done. We're going to transition to the Declaration, and we're going to see Locke's ideas happening. And so here we have Thomas Jefferson, and then the meme that sort of will make all this make sense. The sort of like, I made this. You made this? No, I made this. So this is the Declaration, right? Remember the first few lines of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does that remind you of? Reminds us of Locke, right? And reason teaches all of mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought harm another. I said arm another, it should be harm. No one ought harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. So Jefferson here is using ChatGPT to plagiarize his essay. Locke is ChatGPT. And so here's Jefferson again. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then here's Locke. No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, peaceable living amongst another and a secure enjoyment of their properties. Again, so maybe Jefferson's a little bit more, punchy. Jefferson is perhaps a little bit better of a writer than Locke. And then here, finally, Jefferson, maybe not finally, maybe there's more. Jefferson says that whereby or whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, right? The ends of government being securement of rights, liberty, life, property, pursuit of happiness, whatever. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new form of government, laying its foundations on such principles, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And of course, where he's getting it from, what Locke has to say about this is whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society and endeavor to grasp themselves the lives, liberties, and estates of other people, by this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people have put in their hands, and for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. And perhaps the most egregious plagiarism is here when Jefferson says, "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security." Where is he getting this from? He's getting it from Locke. He says, because Locke says, revolutions happen not upon every little mismanagement of government, mismanagement of public affairs. Somebody fucks their secretary, somebody embezzles some public funds, somebody uses the campaign finance laws to furnish their Steam library. We'll understand that. It'll whatever. We're not going to cause a revolution because of that. Great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, and all the slips of human frailty will be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices all tending the same way, remember, what a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object. When a long train of abuses, is the same. It's just the same language, all tending the same way, make the design of tyranny visible to the people. 'Tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. So, the idea here, Thomas Jefferson was just a bit of a fan, we could say, of Locke, right? And so that's the lecture. We can finish by asking you guys. So Locke seems to think that it's in our power, it's in our right to form a new government, to do revolution, right? Under what circumstances would revolution become justified in the United States today?
Yeah, I just think that revolution is like a scam because there's no universe in today's climate where it ever happens that it isn't either looked at as I would say civil war is the only realistic outcome that leads to a revolution, right? Because it's like any revolution that happens now, at least a large portion of the people that are supposedly the revolutionaries are going to be looked at as criminals by the ruling class, by other people. And so it's like, how do you, this is, I think that's the flaw in his logic, is it's assuming like some sort of unanimity. Like it's assuming that there's a consensus that's and I don't think that's fucking real. Even back then, even if you don't count our like fractious fucking twisted society now, like even back then, I doubt that was a fucking thing, Well,
American Revolution is a Lockean revolution, right? The
yeah,
revolution
but that
of
was
1776. That was a.
But hold on. But even that, right? That was a fraction of what at the time was Britain. It was akin to a civil war. Like there would be some that argued that it was a civil war.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was a very small subset of people here in America that revolted against another subset who looked at them as criminals for doing it. Mm-hmm. And they just happened to win, right? So I guess
I would say it was a majority of the political society that existed in America.
Okay,
the majority of them. But your critique is a good one, which is that we actually have our cleavage in this country has actually gotten into the foundation. Our political community, our political society is the thing that's actually broken apart. That like the underneath the government part. And so doing the revolution, the thing that persists in the Lockean idea that could dismantle the government, we actually don't have one. Ours is actually doing something else.
I mean, yeah, I guess a little bit. I more say that like, I think that we've backed ourselves into a position where let me rephrase it. Maybe I don't think a revolution in modern day America could ever be successful. Maybe that's
because we've taken all your guns or something like that.
Yeah, no, and I don't mean to make it, but yes, you've taken all of our guns. You've brainwashed like a large enough portion of the populace that they would never engage in something like that. Yeah. You have, anytime there's like a hint of that, people are talked about as though they're like low IQ, like, inbred idiots that would ever dream of challenging the intellectual ruling class.
Howard, let's hear from some other folks. That's really good.
I would argue that the guns from the most oppressed members of our society have been taken away. The way, Brian, the way that you have been explaining Locke, like it's kind of clear to me that according to his philosophy, we have more than enough ground to start a revolution right now, right? I pulled up something from the libertyfund.org. It's Locke on Religious Toleration by Mark Goldie. I don't know when this was written, but there's a lovely quote in here that I think is just one like portion of Locke's reasoning of why we could start a revolution, right? Okay, let me just read it. Locke is quite clear that purely religious opinions of any sort cannot provide a ground for civil discrimination. Neither pagan nor Mahometan nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion. Furthermore, not even Native Americans are to be punished for not embracing our faith and worship. That last one, we did that to them. So technically, every discriminated person in our society today has had a ground to start a revolution for hundreds of years. But what societies have been the most maligned when it comes to First Amendment and Second Amendment rights in this country? Those groups.
Yeah. That's great. Really, thank you so much for that. Next week, I what I want to do is read MLK and Malcolm X and make the argument that like, yeah, the African American experience in this country is like a ripe for a Lockean revolution, and yeah, so I'm in very much in agreement.
I just wanted to say I agree with actually both points of view, where I think that you know, I believe that a revolution in the United States of America today is like, you know, would be at this point in time would be virtually impossible, because at the one thing that I feel like this is leaving out, and I say this all the time, but the one thing I feel like this is leaving out, whether that be by, you know, whether that revolution or rebellion would be by whatever, if the people had guns or no.
Yeah.
You know, there's just such a massive difference in how we've been spending like 50 cents of every tax dollar we have for the last 50, 70, 80 years on our military strength.
Yeah.
The government's military strength. You know, so whether or not, you know, whether or not these people have any sort of guns in their home and can stand up against the government, and you know, the vast wealth and the magnitude of power that the United States government has in terms of military presence is so overbearing, it would immediately squash any rebellion, whether that be by people with guns or people who had their guns taken away. And my point in saying all of this is, I think the one thing that this dude has left out is that over time, the American government has become so lopsided. It has become a different type of, it has gotten away from its roots, you know?
Yeah.
There are other countries and other democracies in our world who have rebellions all the fucking time. Constant checkings of power, constant executive.
It's almost as if this political philosophy is like insufficient, or like,
yeah, I
perhaps
agree with that.
not.
I think
not
it's
fit for
beautiful.
today's
Hold on
society.
though. As you guys are talking about this, like Mav, I totally agree with you. The one thing that comes to mind, obviously, is like The Last of Us, and you know how that kind of like how they kind of showed this, you know, civil unrest that they were experiencing. But like the one thing that made all of that possible was like the supply chain issues from this broken down system, right? And so his theory like doesn't bring into account that like it wouldn't be possible now, except for the fact that like if capitalism and all of these systems have enforced climate change to a point where like that sort of supply chain issue becomes inevitable, like at some point that's like, that is, you know, we had COVID and like people are getting sicker and things are getting dirty. What?
I see what you're, sorry, just to be clear, you're saying that it inevitably we are going to put ourselves in a position where we have to rebel because things get so bad as a result of hypercapitalism. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like maybe not, you know, in the next 10 years, but I think that like if we don't change something for climate change, like isn't it like inevitable that like our like we can't sustain the society that we have?
Well, I agree with, and I want to comment on a couple of things, a couple of really interesting things that Joanna said too. But I think that I agree with what Maverick said, and I agreed with what you said right up until that point, Maddie. I think that's completely incorrect, and I think that it's not an inevitability that climate change will lead us down a path of Armageddon where we devolve into fucking, you know, Lord of the Flies. But I do think that you bring up a really good point in the sense that look at what's happening in Ukraine. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. Look at what happens every time you have a disproportionately large and organized and trained force fighting against incumbents, right? Incumbents who are in their homes, who are fighting for their liberties, who are less well armed, who are not fucking organized, but who aren't giving up. And they bleed the fucking invading party dry. And in this case, the invading party on their own soil would be the United States government. And all those hillbillies and backwoods idiots with AR-15s, I promise you, they would put up a fight for a long time and it would get ugly. Would they ultimately win? I don't know. Would it turn into 1984 eventually? I mean, we're fucking already on their way there. You can't say what you want without getting in trouble. But I certainly think that there would be a lot of bloodshed and it would be a very, very uncomfortable and difficult process for both the ruling class, i.e. the US government, and the fucking quote unquote revolutionaries. And to Joanna's point, I think she's absolutely right. And that's the problem with further digging into our Second Amendment rights, because it's true. Who is the fucking one that's suffering the most? I'm not. No one's fucking coming after my guns. I'll tell you who it is. It's marginalized peoples. It's people who are growing up without the socioeconomic ability to purchase guns, without the ability to fight for their Second Amendment rights in court when those rights are infringed upon by police officers. And those people's ability to revolt and to protect their rights has been removed from them. And that's why the Second Amendment is so important, regardless of what your political leanings are, because it directly takes away the ability of those minorities to support and advocate for themselves. And so I think that's a very, very good point.
It's so easy to, it's what I find interesting about these classes, or not classes, whatever the fuck they are, of us participating in these, is it's so easy to take what this dude wrote so long ago and attribute it directly to what our political issues are today. And what I think is funny about that is like it's just so you said it, Brian, you said that these are obsolete, or you said what was the word you used?
Well, it's just like it's not a good fit, right? Like
yeah,
like maybe we've outgrown it, right?
Well, yeah, or maybe outgrown you know, I guess we've strayed away from it. You know, I don't know if growth is the word term that I would use. But I think that the idea of us again, I just think it all comes back to economics, time and time again. You know, I think that, you know, the every time we devolve into another argument, it's just very obvious to me that the greed aspect is like left out of this fucking document, you know. And then over time, the greed aspect like eats this document from the inside out, and we end up in a position where things are really fucked up, you know, like they are in 2023.
I think you make an interesting point, Maverick. Because when you say greed is left out of this, and this is just a theory, but to me it makes sense why, because the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened yet, right?
Right, totally.
Nobody could have conceived of AR-15s, airplanes, you know, like we have so rapidly advanced our technology in just the last 120 years alone. Mm-hmm. And look at all the crazy shit that's gone down just because of technology.
Yeah, totally.
So I think yeah, there was no accounting for any of this. Yeah.
That's what I meant by outgrown. That like, yeah, and so like I think one question to ask would be something like, well, where does Locke like think power actually resides? And then he would say something like, well, political power, right? Is like that's that's like what we're concerned about is like, but like if we ask us, I think we all would sort of recognize actual power as existing in the economy, right?
Yeah.
Modern modern life is sort of like lived through the convergence of like 7 or 8 like major brands, of like corporations, like we just sort of like exist in our lives as like underneath these like massive structure, like superstructures of like the modern corporation. And so, and like I think it's much easier to sort of identify and locate perhaps tyrannical but power in the economic structures. And Joanna, I think you're absolutely right that like when Locke is creating a political economy based on property rights, he doesn't envision it sort of like eating itself, having the economic part coming back and eating. Howard, you're muted somehow, so I can't hear you. But like that's like what I think is like left out of this, and I think that you guys are in agreement about that. And we have to wait till Marx to sort of really sort of develop that critique of this idea. I don't know. I think Howard's having some issues here. I don't know if he wants to speak or if he's frozen or something. There's other things we could say about revolution, reasons why we might not want a revolution. I think we're right that it's like unrealistic, but like, the resort to violence, when you hear revolution, you might think, oh, this is going to be a violent revolution. And like, in some respect, that's like not always, it doesn't have to be the case that it's a violent revolution. We could do something, if we really think that economics is where power is, we could do a general strike, you could do, you could just not show up to work, all of us. That would bring down the American government, if like 85% of the country decided to not go to work tomorrow and not go to work until, things change, that would be a much more powerful revolution than anything anybody or any group of people with AR-15s could do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like Maddie mentioned how coronavirus is, it killed like, I don't know how many people, what the numbers were, but like that, we're talking 30% price hikes and like insane shit has gone on from what I felt was like a relative. I mean, I don't want to diminish the effects of it or whatever, but it's, it wasn't a civil war. It wasn't an 85% person strike. It was like, I don't know. It just seemed like we were fucking rocked by that.
Yeah,
really,
right.
really. Like, we're gonna feel the effects for that for years and years and years and years, and that was a year of people getting sick. I don't know. It seems
totally, yeah. The economy sort of runs the show, right? It's like our politics is sort of like it's like getting the cart before the horse. If we start thinking that like power is in the political realm, and not worrying about the economy sort of tells us what to do, and again, so that's a Marxist take, and we should wait till Marx. But so there's one way to do revolution. Doesn't have to be violent. You could do that type. There's a
Florida
danger of
right now is
failure.
kind of I would imagine hurting a little bit with the immigrants not going to work.
Did you say Florida? What'd you say?
Yeah, Florida.
I don't know about this. I don't know what you mean. Can you
There's a strike.
Tell me more?
There's a working strike that immigrants are refusing.
Oh, no way.
To go to work. Yeah.
I need to find out about this.
Yeah, it's actually really fucked things up. The trucking industry in Florida right now is like, you can't get there's no freight going in and out of Florida right now because
that's why my loads weren't getting bid on today. I was trying to find out why. I was trying to get a 53 foot from Florida to Texas to, okay.
Yeah, there's
Not
like gnarly
happening.
strikes going on.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that could really, it just like, that's where, our lives are lived, it's like in the economy. It's like I can ask every one of you guys are going to tell me about your jobs more than you're going to tell me about who you voted for, or like what you think about politically, like our politics is about our jobs more often than not.
Hey,
We're
hey,
gonna
Brian,
end
I'm
right
really
now.
sorry, man. I
Yeah, we're
gotta
ending.
go. Okay.
See you later. Yeah, so there's a danger of failure in revolution, right? There's also a danger of success, right? Because if we are successful, here we are, we've toppled the government, we have to make a new one, and like there's a chance that the one we make is going to be worse than the one we dissolved. So like, there's all these things that we could like, talk about with revolution. It's really interesting, but Locke gives us all this. I don't have anything to wrap it up, but it's really fun that we ended up talking about strikes and labor and the economy, because I think that's the right critique of Locke, is like the one that says, well, in our modern lives, this doesn't seem like a good fit for us, because the economy you think is going to be, so great because it's based on property rights, is kind of unwieldy now. Anyway, see you later, guys. That's it. That's all that I got. So
Thanks,
thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks.